The Houston Texans in 2024 had arguably the worst offensive line, the worst play caller, and injuries to their 3-star receivers and their star running back, yet despite all that, they still managed to make it to the second round of the playoffs. So in today's video, I want to talk about the Houston Texans and why they are heavily underrated heading into 2025. Subscribe and like the video if you do go on to enjoy. Let's hop into it. So yes, I do believe the Houston Texans are severely underrated heading into this upcoming season, and there's a number of reasons why. The first reason why I think the Houston Texans are underrated is I think we're all underrating how good of a quarterback CJ Stroud truly is. Now let's not lie to ourselves. 2024 was a bit of a struggling year for CJ Stroud. He was by no means a perfect quarterback by no stretch. But even despite that, he still managed to get 3,700 passing yards and 20 touchdowns. Yes, he did see an increase in interception. His efficiency went down quite a bit. I think the biggest thing that was a bit concerning with him was the amount of sacks he took last year. He took 52 total sacks compared to 38 in his rookie year. But again, in some ways, I do want to defend Stroud here. That offensive line last year was not very good. Now, we'll talk about the offensive line heading into the later portion of the video because I still have some concerns about the unit, but I think the biggest reason why I'm not overly concerned about Stroud this year is with the new play caller now in town. Hopefully, he will give more power and leniency to CJ Stroud to be a bit more of the leader of this team. To me, it is part of the progression of a quarterback. The first 2 to 3 years, you kind of get coddled. The coach is doing all the things for you. He's giving you the play call. He's managing the offensive line. He's helping you go through progressions occasionally. But now that you're heading into your third year, you're kind of a veteran at this point. You've already played 2 full seasons. You have a new play caller now. I imagine there will be a world where Stroud is going to get a lot more of a command of the offense to where he can now dictate where the offensive line shades over to. He can now dictate formations, where to put the running back if he's going to block somebody, all those sort of things that he might now start doing. Things that in the past he probably at times had some control of, but probably more of anything was controlled by the OC. So I think because of that, I do expect Stroud, who I think is a very smart and capable quarterback, to have more power over this offense, which I think will actually help this offense. I expect him statistically to look a lot more like his rookie season, where he had a little over 4,100 passing yards and 23 touchdowns to only 5 picks. I expect him to be even better than that. I'm expecting somewhere of over 4,000 passing yards, probably like 25 or more touchdowns, and hopefully less than 10 picks. I'm a big fan of who they hired as the OC, and I think he's going to fit perfectly next to CJ Stroud. Assuming Stroud continues his progression and continues to get better, and assuming the offensive line takes some steps forward, then I do think for the most part Stroud should be really good. As I mentioned in the introduction of this video, he had a lot of obstacles to overcome. Part of those were the injuries. Stephon Diggs missed basically the entire season, which was unfortunate because he was looking really good there for a little bit. Nico Collins had some injuries he was dealing with. Tank Dell missed a portion of the season. Joe Mixon missed a lot of time too. So he had a lot of injuries surrounding him. And despite all that, even with poor offensive line play and having to play with, some backup receivers occasionally, Stroud was still doing a pretty fine job. I did feel like later in the season last year, he at times started to lose a little bit of faith within the unit, with the receivers, and sometimes especially with the offensive line. It looked like at times some things a little bit overwhelmed him and he was just trying to Superman those things, which is fine. Obviously, he's a young quarterback. That sort of stuff is going to happen. But the hope for the future is that Stroud doesn't have to feel that much pressure to be the reason why this team is consistently winning, because the team is super stacked around him, that hopefully Stroud just has to do his part to get this team going in the right direction. He's a very smart quarterback. I still believe that he can end up being a top 10 quarterback by the end of the season, probably a Pro Bowler, maybe even an all-pro guy. I'm not going to give him the expectations of MP like we did last year. I just think that's a little bit unfair for such a young quarterback. But I think he could definitely get his name up there with some Pro Bowlers and maybe even some All-Pros. The next reason why I think that this team is a very underrated team is this offense is extremely loaded with talent. Let's start off with the running backs. You add a Nick Chubb in the offseason to pair alongside Joe Mixon. Now, Joe Mixon is expected to miss time, but I hope that he will be able to come back sometime early into the season. I think the combination of Joe Mixon and Nick Chubb is quite interesting because neither one of them necessarily gives you that elite athleticism that you might think of when you have a bit more of an older running back. One, you might want to add an RB2 that has a bit more explosiveness. Take, for example, the Baltimore Ravens, who have Derrick Henry as their star running back, who is a bit more of that bruiser style guy. And then alongside him, you have a Keaton Mitchell, who is that explosive athlete. They don't quite have that on this team. They have Joe Mixon, who isn't necessarily a bruiser. He's more of a finesse guy that can go up there and break some tackles, but he's also not as explosive as maybe he once was. And obviously Nick Chubb is very much the same. Used to be an elite running back. Injuries have seriously derailed a very promising career, and now his explosiveness is just not quite there. But I think the nice thing about it is those guys sort of have a similar running style. So if Mixon were to miss time, then you could just throw Nick Chubb out there and you're going to get a very similar guy. In the receiving core, I truly think this team is very, very deep in this core. They did just trade away John Mechie to the Eagles, which I actually thought was a pretty interesting trade. I kind of understand why they did it, because obviously they drafted Jalen Noel and they have a couple other guys who are a bit on the shorter side that kind of can fill his role. But I thought they would at least keep him for one more year because of how many injuries they had last year. Regardless though, Nico Collins is truly one of those special alpha #1 wideouts. Some people have him ranked in the top 5. I have him slightly outside my top 5. My top 5 would probably be Chase, Jefferson, CD, probably AJ. And I think Nico has a conversation for that number 5 spot. I would probably end up putting like a Puka Nacua or somebody like that, but Nico could obviously be there as well. The one knock on Nico Collins' game is that he just really struggles with injuries. And it's not like he's missing, 6 or 7 or 8 weeks at a time or out for a whole season. He's just missing a handful of games here and there. That's always a little bit frustrating. But when he is on the field, he is truly like that top guy, like a Pro Bowl, all-pro caliber guy. He has a great connection with Stroud, and I think if he can manage to stay healthy for the majority of next year, he's going to be in for a nice season. You added in a Christian Kirk, who at this stage of his career is not as explosive as he used to be, but he is just a savvy veteran that finds ways to get open. And you pair him now alongside Nico Collins and some of the draft picks they took, I think it's a really solid fit. They then doubled down in receiver. Actually, they doubled and quadrupled down with adding the 2 Iowa State guys in Jaden Higgins, who I was a big fan of. Not necessarily the freakiest of athletes. He's not going to be, your future Nico Collins, but he's a very similar player in some ways to Nico, where he's got good size, good length, and can kind of just do a bit of everything. He can win downfield. He can be a technician. I think he has a very developed route tree for his age. And so I think he's just a perfect fit here. If Nico were to miss time, I think Jaden Higgins would be a very capable #1 for a couple games. And then Jalen Noel, his Iowa State teammate, very much an explosive guy that can win downfield, primarily will probably play in the slot and will dominate in the underneath to intermediate game. He will very much play probably a very similar role to what we saw Stephon Diggs do at times last year, which is primarily play on the slot. Occasionally, he'll fill in on the outside. He'll be in some jumbo formations. I really am intrigued to see how much playing time is split between Christian Kirk and Jalen Noel. I think those guys, in some ways, have a bit of redundancy, but Kirk is a bit older, Noel's a bit younger, so I'm really intrigued to see how that duo kind of pans out. I wonder if they'll actually ever see the field at the same time. I'm sure they will occasionally. Can't forget Tank Dell. He's going to miss probably a big chunk of the season. Let's hope that he can come back and, be his normal self. At tight end, Dalton Schultz, he's just ultra reliable. You know what you're going to get with Dalton Schultz. You have Cade Stover there as well, so some pretty decent talent there in the tight end room. We'll save the offensive line for a little bit later because I still have some concerns with that unit, but I want to save that for a later portion, kind of discussing some of the cons of this team. Let's talk about the next reason why this team is severely underrated, and that is the defense is super loaded with talent with an awesome head coach who's their defensive play caller. Defensively, this team has basically everything you want. They can stuff the run, they can get after the quarterback, they can create turnovers in the back end. This is a very not flawed defense. If there was anything they could potentially improve upon, it might be their run defense, but even then, it's still very, very good. You have 2 great pass rushers into Neil Hunter and Will Anderson, who are both guys that can get you 10 or so sacks a season. They're both high upside guys. Hunter being a bit older, and then Will Anderson being a little bit older, a bit younger. You also add in a Darrell Taylor. You have some dudes in the interior who aren't necessarily pass rushers, more of guys who are going to stuff the run, but can get you a sack here or there. Your linebackers, Henry, Azeez Ojulari, you got to feel really good about. You also added EJ Speed, who was a starter for multiple years for Indianapolis. And the secondary, Derek Stingley, he was incredible last year, just got paid, I believe. He's somebody that can easily get you 5+ interceptions. He's just one of those guys who is an absolute ball hawk while also being a shutdown corner. Kamari Lassiter had a great year last year for Houston. If he takes that next step forward, he should be really good. Jalen Petrie can probably play on the nickel. You drafted Jalen Smith as well from, I think, USC. Your safeties, you also added CJ Gardner-Johnson, who is just another one of those dudes who can create turnovers at like a plenty. Kalen Bullock, Jalen Reed is also there too. So a whole lot of talent in the secondary of just guys who can absolutely get after it, both in run defense, but primarily as ball hawks. I think they have arguably the best, if not one of the best cornerback duos in Kamari Lassiter and Derek Stingley. Those guys just work so perfectly. They're big, they're strong, they're physical, and they're lengthy, and they're talented, and they're young, and they both can create turnovers. It's just really one of those dominant duos. And then I think they got a bunch of guys that are willing to get down and fill their run fits. This is just an incredible defense. I think this defense should probably be top 10, probably even top 5 next year. If you guys watched my top 10 defensive video, which I might be pinned up at the very end, or you guys can just check out my channel and watch that video later, you guys would know that I had this defense, I want to say, in my top 5, or at least very close to my top 5. So I feel really good about this unit. I think they're ridiculously talented. And D'Amico Ryans has proven to me to be, you know, a really solid head coach, or specifically a really solid defensive play caller. I feel very good about him as this team's coach, and, you know, the future of what they might look like with this guy. Let's talk about their division now. This division, let's just keep it a stack, kind of sucks. It's not a very good division. Now, there's talent in this division. I think the Colts are just as talented as the Texans in a lot of ways, but they're starting Daniel Jones. And if you guys watched my last video, which I'll probably have pinned up at the very end as well, you guys would know that I am not a big fan of the decision to start Daniel Jones. I think Daniel Jones is the worst starting quarterback in this division, and that's even behind a Cam Ward. And I think if we're looking at the entirety of the NFL, Daniel Jones would be a bottom 5 quarterback in the entire league. Now, I think that Colts team is talented enough to still give a Houston or, you know, any AFC team a run for their money. But at the end of the day, you're always going to have that quarterback advantage, which gives you the big advantage come later in the season. So I think for Houston, you're really not competing with anyone. I think Jacksonville could be very much improved, but I think they have a lot of work to still get done. I like Trevor Lawrence. I think he's very talented, but he hasn't shown anything to me quite yet. And then surrounding him, you do have Travis Hunter and Brian Thomas Jr., which will be a great duo. But what does the rest of the offense look like? What does the run game look like? And the defense also has a ton of questions. So I think the Jacksonville Jaguars are probably a year away from seriously fighting this Texans team. And then Tennessee, they might be a little bit better, but not enough to compete with Houston. So for Houston, I think you have a really, really good shot of easily winning this division yet again, which guarantees you at least one home playoff game. And we've seen the past 2 years when they get into that first round after winning the division, they've won the past 2 times, and I think they'll easily probably do that again this year. Now let's talk about the offensive line. Now, if you guys have watched any of my Texans videos in the past, you guys would know that I have been pretty critical of this offensive line, and I'm going to stand 10 toes down here. I do not think this offensive line is very good, but I think with the improvements of Stroud, with the improvements of the play calling, I think the offensive line could be at least capable enough this year to get this team maybe 1 or 2 steps forward. Cam Robinson at left tackle, you feel pretty good about. He's been a solid starter for most of his career. He's not a shutdown tackle. He's not a Lane Johnson or a Jordan Mailata or anything like that, but he's fine. He gets the task done. At your right tackle spot, it was Blake Fisher, but Blake Fisher was not playing very good, so I'm assuming now it's going to be Ariante Ursery, which I like Ursery. I think he's a very talented guy, but I thought he needed at least like 1 year of development, or maybe to stick inside to play guard, because I do have some concerns with his game. With that said, I think he can arguably be the best right tackle option for this team. You do have Titus Howard, you do have Laken Tomlinson, you do have Jake Andrews in the interior. I don't love the interior. I think it's kind of mediocre, but I think it's fine. It gets the task done. There's some depth here too with Juice Scruggs, who has some playing time under his belt. Jarrett Patterson, Ed Ingram, some guys here and there. Ariante, I think, can also move inside if you really need him to. I don't love this offensive line. I think it's very concerning, and I hope in the future they seriously start to address this with some first-round picks being spent on offensive line like they maybe should have done this year. But, you know, I think this offensive line could get the task done for at least 1 year. I don't think they'll be good. I still think they'll probably be a bottom 10 unit in the league, but last year they were arguably the worst. I don't think they'll be the worst this year, but they probably will not be anywhere near the top 15. So all in all, I think this Houston Texans team has a lot to look forward to. The AFC is quite open this year. I think the top 3 teams in the AFC are already kind of set. You're going to be facing the Bills, the Chiefs, or the Ravens at some point in the playoffs. And if you are Houston, if you can get through that first round matchup, whether you go up against a Denver, LA, or whoever, right, you're going to be probably playing them in a home game, whether you're the 3 seed or the 4 seed, or maybe the 2 seed if things really work out this year. You'll probably end up winning that first round matchup because that's what history has shown us. And then in that second round matchup, you have to just handle your business versus potentially a Buffalo or a Baltimore, right? Or maybe a Kansas City. And I think this Texans team has the personnel to actually compete with those rosters. Now, I would probably take the Chiefs, the Bills, or the Ravens at face value over the Texans in terms of who would I pick to win those games. I'd probably pick those teams. But in the playoffs, anything can truly happen. I think Houston has the talent to seriously match up against any team. And with this defense, the way they can create turnovers, if a Lamar or a Josh Allen or somehow a Patrick Mahomes were to have a bad day, this defense could turn their bad day into an absolute nightmare. And all of a sudden, next thing you know, you're beating the Chiefs or the Bills or the Ravens by, 10 points because of how your defense is playing. This defense, to me, is the driving force of this unit. I think if the defense can continue to dominate as they have been, I truly do believe this Texans team has what it takes to seriously compete with the likes of the Chiefs, the Bills, or the Ravens. Again, I do think they're the 4th best team in the AFC, pretty easily behind those top 3 teams. But I think if Stroud could take that big step forward like we expect him to take, if this offensive line can just be good enough this year, and if the defense can really be as dominant as I think they will be, then I think this Texans team has what it takes to dominate next year. They're going to easily cruise to win the division. When you look at their schedule, it's not the easiest schedule in the world, but it's also not the hardest schedule in the world. You have the Rams in week 1, which I think will tell you a lot about this team, especially that offensive line. You have Tampa Bay in week 2, another big game. You have Baltimore in week 5. Denver in week 9, I think will tell you a lot about your offensive line as well, because that Denver defense can go. You got Buffalo later in the season. You got Kansas City. You have the LA Chargers later in the season. But surrounding those games, you do have a couple of layup games where you can get some easy wins, like, for example, the Tennessee Titans, the Colts, the Raiders, some of those middling teams that you should be able to handle your business. So the nice thing about this Texans schedule is you do have that mixture of really tough opponents that is going to test this team, but surrounding those games that you're getting tested in, you'll also have some games that you can, refine your craft. And the nice thing is if you go in there and you handle your business versus some of these top tier teams, you'll have some experience of what it's like to beat these guys heading into the playoffs. You're not going to head into the playoffs thinking, oh, we can't beat these teams, when you've already faced them in the regular season and maybe you lost by a close margin or maybe you won those games. So Houston will have the familiarity with those rosters as they get into the playoffs, and that could play it to a bit of an advantage, or maybe could hurt them because the other team also gets the film as well. All in all, I think Houston's a great team. I think they have a truly great chance of winning it. And no, you can see the Texas flag and the Texas Funko Pop. I'm not a Texans fan. I'm actually a Dallas Cowboys fan. But I think the Houston Texans are a really good team, and I think they have a really good chance to go all the way. So you let me know in the comment section below, how far do you think the Texans will go? And are they the best team in the AFC? Let me know. Love you guys. Peace.